Here's a fact most admins won't say out loud. Service accounts are often your weakest security link, and you can't just rotate the password out of this problem. Today, we compare traditional strategies with Microsoft Entra ID workload identities, the only approach built from the ground up for controlling non-human access. If you're tired of patchwork solutions and want to see what a real upgrade looks like, you're in the right place. The mess we inherited, why service accounts break zero trust. If you've ever wondered why a supposedly locked down environment still keeps you up at night, it almost always comes back to the service accounts that nobody wants to talk about. These aren't just one or two special logins. Almost every organization has a small army of them. Think about the classic pain points, those password spreadsheets tucked away in someone's OneDrive, dusty little scripts running in the background of legacy apps, or the mythical break glass admin account that only gets touched when things go sideways, if anyone remembers the password at all. The reality is, even the environments with strict MFA and lockdown everywhere else always seem to have a side door for these non-human users. Let's be honest, the first time you try to audit privileged access in a large environment, you end up swimming upstream against a tide of forgotten service accounts. Admins mean well. They really do. Maybe I'd inherited a few hundred of these accounts with vague names like Backup Job 1 or SVC Legacy App. Maybe nobody's quite sure what the account does, so it never gets disabled, just in case. You might go through the motions of password rotation, but there's no magic wand to guarantee risk actually goes away. The uncomfortable truth here is that service accounts get a permanent hall pass. They're almost never enrolled in MFA, and trying to force a conditional access policy usually brings down a dozen critical automations no one wants to touch. If security best practices are a checklist, these accounts are the box you never really get to tick. That's where attackers start paying attention. In most of the red team reports I've seen, the easiest path to domain admin isn't brute forcing a user. It's finding a service account that's been holding the same static password for 3 years. Just have a look at the aftermath of incidents like the SolarWinds breach, or even some of the better documented ransomware attacks. More often than not, privileged service accounts are the keys that make lateral movement effortless. Why bother with phishing high-profile users when you can lift a plaintext credential from a config file or snag it from an old script nobody maintains? Service accounts are like the spare key under the doormat. Attackers know exactly where to look, and they know the odds are good that nobody's been checking there. The governance mess runs deeper, even in organizations that pride themselves on zero trust. Nothing about managing service accounts actually fits the model. Zero trust is supposed to mean every request gets checked, verified, and tracked. Service accounts have a different set of rules. They're rarely monitored, operate with broad and sometimes unlimited permissions, and weave through on-prem, cloud, and every corner of your environment. There's no consistent visibility and not much appetite to clean things up, since doing so risks breaking critical processes. It's no surprise that identity lifecycle management falls off a cliff. A user leaves your company, HR can close their account in minutes. A legacy integration gets retired or replaced. Good luck tracking the ghost accounts left behind, especially when documentation is light. It's a bit like installing top-of-the-line locks on your front door, but leaving the back window wide open. The front might be bulletproof, but your weakest point is still inviting trouble, and you know the attackers will find it. That's not just theory. Penetration tests and post-breach forensics keep showing the same lesson. Service accounts get overlooked, they keep the same passwords, and the blast radius when they're compromised is huge. What's worse is the lack of visibility. You might have CM tooling for user actions, but try getting a clean log of what SVC Backup 02 did last Thursday. If you find anything at all, it probably raises more questions than it answers. Let's talk about static credentials for a second. Passwords on service accounts don't rotate automatically. They don't have natural lifecycle events. If a business process changes, those accounts hang around just in case and slowly become orphaned. Someone might script a password change, but the number of scripts that just keep working with an old password is higher than anyone wants to admit. These ghost accounts start to pile up, each one a potential entry point for someone with the patience to look. Over time, those exceptions turn into permanent risks, especially with non-human users that touch many resources across cloud and on-prem. Of course, most IT teams want to move to zero trust for everything, but this is where reality checks in. Applying conditional access to a script or legacy automation usually means instant outages. MFA on a non-human user, if only. Usually you end up handing over broad privileges to make sure the process doesn't break, then praying nothing bad happens. These accounts force security teams into making exceptions that would never fly for real users. So every control becomes watered down before it ever gets to production. So here's the punchline. Zero trust isn't failing because you have bad intentions or poor tools. It's that the traditional way we treat service accounts is simply incompatible with the whole idea of zero trust. No matter how many layers you build for your users, if your non-human access stays in the shadows, the gap never closes. You're always playing catch-up, just one missed account away from your next incident. Managed identities were supposed to patch this all up with the promise of secret-free deployments and tight cloud integrations. But have they really fixed the problem or just painted over the cracks? Managed identities, better, but still a compromise. At first glance, managed identities look like they finally solved the service account headache. Developers get to skip secret storage, credentials never land in config files, and everything just works inside Azure. Grant the right permissions, and your app or automation picks up what it needs. No password vaults, no sticky notes, no calling someone in the middle of the night to find out where a credential is stored. There's a reason cloud teams reach for managed identities as soon as they spin up a new resource. It's the easy button that promises fewer secrets to rotate and less to worry about when securing cloud apps. You can even see the relief on a developer's face when they realize they don't have to hassle with key vaults or environment variables full of sensitive strings. But there's a catch hiding in the fine print. Managed identities were designed with a strong Azure focus, and this shows in how and where they're used. They work beautifully when you're dealing with Azure Functions, virtual machines, logic apps, or anything that fits neatly into Microsoft's cloud patterns. The trouble shows up the minute your environment colors outside those lines. As soon as you talk about integrating with on-premises systems, connecting to a third-party SaaS, or even orchestrating across multiple clouds, managed identities start to hit their limits. For a lot of organizations, those edge cases aren't edge cases at all. They're the reality that makes things work. Picture the sprawl of your typical hybrid setup. Part of your app stack lives in Azure, but there are legacy databases on-prem, file shares in odd places, and some parts tucked into AWS or Google Cloud. Managed identities, as they stand, don't cover all these scenarios. So while you get secretless authentication for Azure resources, those same workloads still need old school credentials to reach most other things. The promise of no secrets, no manual cleanup, no headaches falls apart at the boundaries. It's like paving a beautiful road that ends at your property line. The traffic keeps going, but the asphalt stops. And for all their strengths, managed identities don't offer fine-grained lifecycle management. You can grant or revoke access, but figuring out which applications are actually using which identities rarely feels straightforward. Tracking usage isn't built in, auditing changes is basic at best, and if something goes stale, you might not notice until it causes an outage or gets flagged during an audit. When it's time to clean things up, say you retire a workload or move to a different integration, you're back to spreadsheets and manual reviews, double-checking which managed identities can safely be removed and which are still active somewhere else. There isn't an easy way to link a managed identity to a business owner or hold someone accountable for its existence, so orphaned identities accumulate just like the service accounts they were meant to replace. Conditional access introduces another wrinkle. Enforcing strong policy controls on a managed identity isn't the same as with user identities. The guardrails for least privilege, step-up authentication, or context-aware access don't really translate over. Most managed identities are all or nothing. You set broad permissions because you don't want to break things, and then you leave them alone. If you want to see who's using a managed identity, why, and from where, the logs are thin. There's no entitlement management or deep integration with high-level governance checks. Auditors will still ask who approved this access, who reviews it, can you prove it's been shut off when no longer needed. Most organizations are left cobbling together answers using Azure activity logs, custom scripts, and a bit of hoping for the best. This isn't just theory. Cloud architects ahead of the curve will tell you they still supplement managed identities with additional controls. Some teams use PowerShell scripts to report on activity. Others maintain their own mapping spreadsheets, trying to keep track of which identities touch which resources. A few have even built in-house governance bots that try to enforce least privilege through policy reviews, sending Slack or Teams notifications when something looks odd. Everyone agrees managed identities are miles ahead of static service accounts for Azure-native workloads, but nobody's pretending they represent full governance. They're a major step forward. Risk is lower, secrets are fewer, but those persistent blind spots remain. The net result is clear. Managed identities help, but they don't stamp out the underlying risk. They clean things up for the Azure slice of your world, then hand the problem back to you once you step outside Microsoft's house. Identity lifecycle, deep auditing, and true zero trust enforcement for non-human access, still up to you, still disconnected, still riddled with exceptions every time reality doesn't fit the Azure story. That's why the next evolution is getting so much interest. Imagine having the same level of control, oversight, and policy for your apps, scripts, and bots as you do for users, without the trade-offs and without the usual governance compromises. That's where workload identities start to change the conversation. Workload identities, non-human access finally grows up. If you've ever stared at a service account and thought, why does this thing still exist? Then you'll get why Microsoft Entra ID workload identities feel like a genuine departure from the usual half measures. Up to now, most of us just rolled with whatever worked for getting a job done, plug a credential in, grant enough permissions to keep the errors away, and hope nobody ever asks for a justification when the security report comes due. That's not a strategy, it's more of a survival tactic. But truthfully, almost nobody's experienced what a real non-human identity platform looks like until now, because most products in this area were never really built for the weird, sprawling mess of automation, integration, and custom line of business apps that actually run companies. They were patched together, always with the idea that apps aren't people, so who cares? But every automation and every connector glued to a Power Platform app actually needs governance. Otherwise, you've just recreated the old service account mess with new tools. Microsoft Entra ID workload identities were designed with one specific idea: treat any non-human access, whether it's a bot, script, connector, or API call, as something that deserves the full security treatment. It doesn't matter if this user is a scheduled PowerShell script updating SharePoint or a third-party SaaS integration glued to your Dynamics 365. You assign it an explicit identity, tie it to a specific resource or business process, and suddenly you have a name and face for something that used to lurk in the shadows. This feels simple in concept, but it rewrites the rules for how you apply governance. Instead of one-off exceptions, you treat every bit of automation as a first-class citizen in your directory. No more break-glass accounts quietly running with domain admin behind the scenes. It's the difference between guessing who left the back door open and finally having a working camera and a log of every movement. For years, non-human identities have been an afterthought. They had no real life cycle, no onboarding or offboarding, and barely any policy enforcement beyond the initial creation. Someone in IT would spin up a credential, then everyone silently agreed not to touch it, because nobody wanted to be the one who broke the mission-critical sync job. Compliance was a headache, documentation was always out of date, and audits turned into scavenger hunts. If someone wanted to rotate a password, half the team would show up just to roll back if something failed. It was almost designed to fail silently and slowly over time. Workload identities pull together the pieces that were always missing. Now, if you want to apply conditional access to a bot or a script, you can. If you want to enforce risk-based policies for a connector that moves data between systems, there's nothing stopping you. Identity protection, just-in-time access, and audit trails are no longer human-only features. Every identity in the environment gets the same guardrails. You have one place to see which automations are live, who owns them, what permissions they've got, and when they last authenticated. Details that used to require spreading out 10 different logs or guessing based on IP addresses are suddenly transparent. Automatic credential rotation on a workload identity means you're not left wondering if someone remembered to update the secret in 5 configs and 6 key vaults. It rotates, the workload picks up the new credential, and nobody gets paged because the integration broke. Permissions can be scoped as tightly or as broadly as the process requires, so you're not forced into an all-or-nothing approach just because the identity isn't tied to a person. When the business process changes, maybe you move your HR integration to a new vendor, it's not a scramble. Decommissioning a workload identity means linked entitlements, sign-in records, and associated secrets all get closed out with it. No more orphans lingering for years, quietly leaching risk into your environment. Let's talk specifics for a second. Say you have a Power Platform connector that pushes data into Dataverse every night. Old school approach, static service account, generic permissions, password rotated on a schedule nobody believes in. Now, assign a workload identity instead, The connector gets a unique identity in Entra ID, limited to just what it needs, monitored like any employee account. If the connector misbehaves, shows unusual sign-in activity, or exceeds its entitlements, alerts fire just like for any risky sign-in by a human user. Same story for custom-built apps running integrations with SaaS tools. The days of hiding behind generic credentials and guessing about usage are over. The best part is what this means for governance overall. Suddenly, conditional access policies don't require weird exceptions for bots or scripts. Access reviews apply automatically, so you've got a cadence for recertifying every workload's permissions. The same entitlement management and compliance guardrails you expect for users flow over to the apps and automations that actually run the company. And there are no sacred cows. Machines get the same treatment as people, right down to last login, owner assignment, and lifecycle trigger. Microsoft highlights workload identities as a fundamental part of zero trust in their architecture papers. They're not alone. Even industry analysts and security researchers have pointed out that unless non-human users come under the same governance layer as employees, you'll always have a blind spot. Bringing workload identities under the zero trust umbrella isn't a nice to have. It closes what's probably the last big identity gap standing between you and true every identity security. Now, there's zero ambiguity about who or what has access, with records for every interaction and lifecycle event in your environment. So while managed identities cleaned up a slice of the problem, workload identities actually bring it all together. The apps, the scripts, the connectors, each finally managed with the same controls as people. The last loophole is closed, and non-human access is one more thing you can answer for during an audit. But that brings up a practical question. What does it actually look like when auditors are at your door, and how does managing compliance or even just daily operations change once you've got every identity, human or not, in the fold? The practical payoff, compliance, governance, and zero trust realized. If you've ever sat across from an auditor while they flip through your access review process, you know the look. Show us who owns these accounts. Where's the record of credential changes? Who approved access for your bots and integrations? It's never the human accounts that tie you in knots. It's always the shadowy service accounts, the scripts, the custom connectors. Nobody wants to admit they inherited. Most teams quietly dread this part of the audit because the usual playbook is part wishful thinking and part detective work. Even when you have a spreadsheet, odds are it's missing context, out of date, or just cryptic enough that drilling through the trail takes all day. Picture the classic scenario. You pull up Active Directory or Azure AD and dump out a list of non-human users for review. A chunk of them are labeled Do Not Delete or SVC Old CRM. Nobody's quite sure who touches these, what systems still depend on them, or who's responsible for rotating their passwords. The apps that use these accounts are sometimes retired, repurposed, or replaced, but the credentials stay behind, insurance for a rainy day that never comes. During the audit, someone inevitably spends an afternoon guessing which accounts are actually still in use, with the real answer buried somewhere in a config file or maybe just locked inside someone's head. Service accounts built on top of static credentials always underperform in these compliance reviews. Reviews are inconsistent, rotation is hit or miss, and accountability is shaky at best. Workload identities clean up the fog. Instead of vague ownership or accounts with ambiguous purposes, you see every non-human user, whether it's a Power Platform connector, automation script, or SaaS bridge, with a clearly defined owner, assignment, and lifecycle policy. There's no hunting for the origin of an account or why it exists. Each workload identity gets a direct link to a business process, system, or application with an audit trail that shows when it was created, who requested it, and every change or credential rotation along the way. No more standing in front of auditors trying to justify a just-in-case account with broad privileges. If the workflow or connector it serves goes away, the workload identity is flagged for decommission, and cleanup happens as part of lifecycle management. Now, you can point to a system of record and tie every non-human user back to a business need and sunset them cleanly when they're no longer required. With workload identities in the mix, conditional access isn't an afterthought. You can enforce risk-based authentication policies on a Power Platform integration just as easily as you do with a human user's login. If an app or connector starts behaving out of line, maybe a script suddenly attempts off-hours access or reaches for data outside its scope, conditional access can step in to prompt for an extra check or lock down the account while you review. These workloads become visible in the same dashboards as your user accounts. So no more double standards and no more flying blind. Entitlement management, one of those features that often gets bolted on late, becomes part of the routine. You can establish review cycles, force recertification, and even automate access removal when a system integration is decommissioned. Compliance transforms from a scramble into a checkbox exercise. Instead of wrangling screenshots and manually validating each bot and app account, you present a list to the auditors, complete with lifecycle logs from assignment to last use. They can trace every change, see when credentials rotated, and check the access reviews in seconds. It's not that risks have magically disappeared, it's that you've got transparency, repeatable processes, and clear lines of ownership. For most auditors, that's more than enough to pass with confidence rather than caveats. A real example makes this all a bit clearer. Take a Power Platform workflow that moves sensitive data from Dynamics 365 to a third-party SaaS. In the old world, maybe that's handled by a shared generic account used in multiple places, with everyone crossing their fingers that nobody ever disables it. With Workload Identities, the Workflows connector has its own specific policy-governed identity tied to that single integration and monitored independently. If you add a second SaaS process, it gets its own governed identity, never piggybacking off the first. Ownership is clear, permissions are scoped, and activity logs are built in, not something you hope to recreate later if someone asks. Early adopters have been honest, audits go faster. When every bot and custom app sits under the same umbrella as your human users, there are fewer fire drills and fewer please explain escalations. One IT lead at a financial services company told me, "We cut our audit prep time in half and finally stopped stumbling over mystery service accounts every quarter. Fewer orphaned accounts, fewer surprises, and measurable drops in incident volume." The teams I've spoken with also mention how much less time they spend tracking down missing documentation or piecing together why an account was created in the first place. So workload identities don't just patch security holes, they give you a governance model that scales and keeps compliance sustainable, even as your stack grows more complex. So you can finally take non-human access reviews off the list of things that always blow up at audit time. That alone is a shift in how most shops approach identity management for automations and integrations. But then comes the big question, is this truly the only fix for non-human risk or just the best thing we've got for now? It's worth looking at where things go from here. If you've watched your risk register grow with every orphaned service account, workload identities are probably overdue. It's not just about plugging a gap. Bringing non-human access into your security model forces the conversation around zero trust to actually mean something. The reality is security has ignored bots and connectors for long enough. If you want to show auditors, leadership, and your own team that every single identity, script, connector, or app is tracked and governed, this isn't optional anymore. Take a look at your environment with fresh eyes and start mapping out where workload identities fit. You might be surprised what's hiding